Okay, so last time we gave a little rundown on how game theory works, the ideas of Nash equilibrium, dominant and dominated strategies. So what I want to do is give you now a more conventional kind of game that you see in game theory before we move on to how game theory connects to our ideas of oligopoly. So to build our basic example to see a more conventional game in game theory, notably, this one is not one that is really related to our oligopoly discussion, but again, it's practice just as review. We can play the chicken game. So the chicken game is a game that is played all the time, at least when there's not social isolation, where two people are walking toward each other. You might have encountered this just in your everyday life when you're walking down a sidewalk or walking in a mall or a shop, and you are walking in one direction and you see someone coming toward you just because they happen to be going in a different direction. And then there's this question of who should get out of whose way. You can go forward or you can swerve. So those are going to be our strategies, right? These are the two different players. They can either go forward or they can swerve. So each player has two different options. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to go through each one of these cells and we're going to add the payoffs. What's important about these payoffs is not necessarily their actual values, but their values in relation to one another. That's what really matters. Because remember, in game theory, we are comparing two different values. We're seeing which one's bigger. So as long as the hierarchy of which one is bigger, which one is smallest, etc., makes sense, then it doesn't really matter the magnitude. That said, if you go deeper into game theory, you get into stuff where the magnitude does matter, but we're not going to get into that. So we just really want to care about order. So let's build our payoffs. Let's start with the most basic one and give us a baseline to work with, that they both get out of each other's way. So they swerve, and we'll put that at 0, 0. No one is happy about it. No one is sad about it. It's a 0, 0. Now, in cases, though, where someone swerves and the other person keeps plugging on forward, going straight, well, the person who got out of the other person's way, there's a little bit of like, oh, I had to get out of that person's way. I had to clear a path for them. Well, the person who got to go forward maybe get a little like jolt of satisfaction. You might have encountered that when you were walking forward and someone gets out of your way. You kind of feel important. So to capture that, we're going to say that the person who moves forward is better off than if they had swerved, right? They might get a little bit of jolt of satisfaction. We'll call it a payoff of 1. Well, the person who had to get out of the way, they feel a little inferior, whatever it is, they'll get a payoff of -1. Now, this one is just like this one. This one is just like this one, except reverse. You also note I'm not color coding that like I did in the last video, like I did previously, because I want you to get practice on thinking in terms of making sure you know which one is for player 1 and which one is for player 2. Right? In this case, this is for player 1, right? They went forward, the other person swerved, and this payoff is for player 2. Now let's do this last cell. Well, what happens in the last cell when they both go forward? Right, we know, right, if they both swerve, or if one goes forward and the other swerves. But what happens if they both go forward? Well, if they both go forward, they run into each other. Makes a big mess. That's not good for any of them. They look stupid. They drop things. They could get injured, right? It's hilarious. I'm going to give it -5, -5. It's bad for both of them. So here's our basic setup. Let's see what happens. So we can do a simple cell-by-cell inspection. Is swerve Nash equilibrium? No, because I can choose, player 1 can choose to go from swerve to forward, and their payoff would increase by 1. So that's not preferred. Same thing with player 2. Okay, fine. So this is not Nash equilibrium. Sometimes this happens, but this is not Nash equilibrium. Is this Nash equilibrium? It absolutely is. Knowing that the other player is going forward, despite my attempts to convince Lane otherwise, they typically will not go over to forward as well. They don't want to go from -1 to -5. So this is Nash equilibrium, right? We went to here, but we won't leave. So we're not going to go away from here in either case. And similarly, since this is symmetric, this is the same story. This obviously is not Nash equilibrium, so if you're both going to run into each other, unless you're like Lane and I, who stupidly ran into each other, typically, right, you dodge. Right? If that person is very clearly going to probably go forward, you get out of their way. If they're looking like they're walking fast, you get out of the way. If they have a lot of stuff with them, or they're not paying attention, you get out of the way, because they're probably going to keep going forward. By the way, once you realize this payoff matrix and you become interested in being the person that people get out of the way of, you start to pick up little tricks like this. Walk with purpose, walk like you look annoyed. That's a great way to get people to get out of your way. Like I said, look distracted, carry something. Just don't be a dick about it. It's just a kind of fun game to play. These are both our Nash equilibria. One person gets out of the way, and the other person goes forward. Notably, this is what usually happens. When you are walking toward one another, usually one person goes forward, the other person swerves. Sometimes, if you're really polite, maybe both of you swerve because you didn't realize that they were going to swerve as well, so you swerve as well just to be sure because you really want to avoid this. But generally speaking, this is what happens. So this is just a basic example. This is a classic game, the chicken game. It has nothing to do with oligopoly, but I wanted to give you a nice, intuitive game to play so that you can maybe get used to it, because the next one we're going to do, the big one we're going to do, the important one, is one that is a little bit more abstract. So we're going to begin with a story. Imagine Bonnie and Clyde, two famous thieves, have recently robbed a bank. Now, in the process of robbing the bank, when they escaped, they had to kill a guard. Maybe they took the back way and there was a guard out there having a smoke and they killed the guard to get away. So they run. They are then caught by the police. Now, the police have them for robbing the bank. Right? They're going to go to jail for robbing the bank. But they don't have them for the guard. Right? They really want to get them for the guard. They want to be able to put them away for killing the guard and not merely just robbing some bank. The problem is they can both deny robbing, killing the guard. I don't know, you just died. I don't know what's going on. I had nothing to do with that. So what do the police do? The police put them in separate rooms so they cannot communicate. And then they go to one of them and they say, Bonnie, Clyde is about to admit that you were involved in the murder of that guard. And he's going to say you did it. We are quite certain he's going to throw you under the bus. But if you tell us the story that he did it, if you let us know what really happened, that he did it, he killed the guard, then rather than giving you like 10 years in prison, which is what you're looking for, we'll only give you 1 year. But if he pulls on you, if you go to jail, not just for robbing the bank, but for killing the guard, you're going to go for jail for a lot longer. Put you away for 20 years. And then, why don't you think about it? And then they go to the other prisoner, Clyde. Clyde, she's going to turn on you. She knows that you really killed the guard. She thinks that. She thinks she killed the guard. We know that she's the one that actually did it. She's going to say it's you. So you got to turn on her and you got to tell us the truth. Otherwise, and then give them the same deal. What do? Do you cooperate with each other and deny that you were ever involved? You have no idea what's going on with this guard. Or do you defect? Presumably after you killed the guard, Bonnie and Clyde, presumably after Bonnie and Clyde killed the guard, they said, oh, look, let's just pretend that we don't know what's going on. Do you cooperate? Do you stick with that? Do you cooperate with your partner? Or do you defect? Do you throw them under the bus and get the reduced years? Well, let's find out by filling in all of our payoffs. All of these values will be negative because they will reflect years in prison. B for Bonnie, C for Clyde. Let's imagine Clyde betrays Bonnie. Clyde defects and decides to cooperate with the police. And Bonnie continues to say, no, we didn't do it. I know what's going on. Well, he will get just 1 year in prison. She will get a lot more. She not only was involved in this bank robbery, she killed the guard, and she lied about it. She lied to the police. So all that's going to stack up, we'll say 20 years. If the reverse happens, if Clyde says, no, I don't know what we did, and Bonnie says, no, he totally killed her. We were totally involved. The same story. She gets the deal. He gets the big punishment. If they both stick to the story, they get, we'll say 3 years. Why 3 years and not 1 year? Well, because they didn't help the police with anything. The police will punish somebody for lying to them, but they'll also give someone reduced time for cooperating with them, for helping them out, for being an informant, for being a snitch. So none of the, they didn't rat the other one out, so they don't get an amazing deal of 1 year, but they do still get 3 years for robbing the bank. Finally, if they both turn on each other, yeah, she did it. Oh, he did it. Well, then they say, well, then you both killed him, right? Or you both were involved. No one gets a deal, right? In the sense that no one gets extra punished because they were lying to the police, so no one gets extra punished. But you still are going away for jail for a long time. We'll say 15. So this is our game. Let's play the game. Let's start with Clyde. We'll do a cell-by-cell inspection again. Let's go to cooperate. Now, if Clyde decides to defect, he will go from -3 to -1. Does Clyde have an incentive to defect? He absolutely does. So this is non-Nash equilibrium. And Bonnie's, of course, in the same situation, going from -3 to -1. She will also like to defect. Well, what if we're at -20, -1? Knowing that Clyde might defect, would Bonnie like to defect? Absolutely. Look, if he's going to rat her out, I might as well tell the truth. Right? If I'm going to jail anyway, I might as well throw some of the guilt on him, tell the truth, not get punished for taking the whole blame, not get punished for lying to the police, and I will also tell the truth. I will renege on our agreement that I had with Clyde to lie about this. Well, I will say no. Keep in mind, this is why they put them in separate rooms. They don't know what the other person's doing. They have to try to estimate. They have to try to think about it. So this isn't Nash equilibrium either. And of course, this isn't either because they're symmetric. The only Nash equilibrium is here. Well, they both turn on each other. Not only is defect a Nash equilibrium, defect is also the dominant strategies in each case. Right? Defect is the dominant strategy. -1 is greater than -3. -15 is greater than -20. -1 is greater than -3. Negative 15 is greater than negative 20. It's not merely Nash equilibrium, it's the dominant strategy. In other words, they would be so much better off here. Right? This is not only better off for each individual person, it's also better off in the sense that this is only 6 total years in prison. This is 21 years, 21 years. This is 30 total years in prison. This is the worst outcome for them collectively. But the way the game is structured, they have a strong incentive to defect, to turn on each other. So even though they want to be here to establish cooperation and work together, the incentives of the game bring them to here. And this is why we call it the prisoner's dilemma. Easily the most famous and important game in game theory. Its implications are fundamental because there is a very strong incentive to betray one another. And that leads the players, by their own incentives, to enter a suboptimal result. You can see this is very interesting to economists because we typically say, look, under ordinary circumstances, people are what people are incentivized to do are what people want to do. So there's a matching between the social good and the optimal. But when you have screwy incentives, it can actually lead to the individual actions lead to something that is suboptimal for the group. So another application of this is the tragedy of the commons. It's exactly the same idea. By deciding to cooperate with others in the sense of you don't harvest as many trees or as many fish, and that is kind of good for you in the sense that it encourages these things to grow. There's a huge incentive to defect. There's a huge incentive to just take a whole bunch and get all the trees or get all the fish to defect unilaterally. If everyone else is holding back and you're the only one defecting, then you get a huge payoff. But because everyone feels that way, then you end up in the worst possible outcome, right? The tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma are basically the same story. But the prisoner's dilemma is a nice formalization. You can see the incentives make it fall apart, and that leads us to oligopoly, specifically duopoly. So here's our oligopoly game. There are only 2 firms, Arby's and Burger King, that sell fast food or sell hamburgers or whatever it is. I think Arby's sells hamburgers, but we'll just go with A and B. I wanted to pick something with A and B. So Arby's and Burger King, player 1, player 2. Now recall with oligopoly, there's this they're in these 2 different worlds. On one hand, with just 2 firms, this duopoly could very easily act like a monopoly, right? If they just could cooperate, if they just could work together and constrain output together, raise prices and make a lot of money. But they also are competitors. Right? People do choose. They can choose between these 2, right? It's not like choosing between 10 or 20, but it is choosing. So there's a little bit of competitive edge. So there's a tension. And note that this tension perfectly captures our prisoner's dilemma. Because they could cooperate with one another or they could defect. Cooperation is captured in the high price strategy. They establish high prices. Defection is low prices. Let's just establish some numbers. Let's imagine they both establish high prices. Let's suppose they get 30 million in profits each. But if Burger King unilaterally decides to establish a low price, no one's going to go to Arby's anymore. It's too expensive. Burger King is where all the great deals are. So if Burger King establishes the low price, Arby's establishes the high price, then everyone will flood over to Burger King. And, maybe some people will go to Arby's, but not many. You can if you want to make that 0, right? It won't change the game. Similarly, we can do the same thing here. If Burger King sticks with a high price, if it's trying to establish this cooperation, and Arby's betrays them and goes low, it's going to be the same payoff except flipped. If they both go low, then they are going to compete with one another directly, and they it's kind of the same situation as here. They still get the same market share, except they get less money per unit sold because they establish a low price, so they make a lot less. Let's play the game. If they both have high, they get a lot of money. But, oh, it's so tempting to cut prices and then take all their market share. 40 is greater than 30. So this is not Nash equilibrium. Same thing over here, too. 40 is greater than 30, not Nash equilibrium. Okay, well, if we're here, do you have an incentive to go low? Well, you're only making 5. 10 is greater than 5. Burger King might as well go from high to low. Similarly, if we're right here, you're only making 5, you might as well go low as well, right? Because at least you can take some of that market share back. And yeah, they're getting a lot more volume, but I'm just assuming for the purposes of this example that when you cut prices, you're cutting them by a lot. Granted, of course, in reality, it's not a simple case. Obviously, they're high or low because it's a spectrum of prices you can charge. But this is just an illustrative example to show those pressures that we see in oligopoly. Because even though this is the best case for them, right? This is 30 million each in profit, total is 60 million in profit. This is the Nash equilibrium. It's a prisoner's dilemma game. It's exactly the same thing as a prisoner's dilemma game. Low is the dominant strategy. 40 is greater than 30. 10 is greater than 5. 40 is greater than 30. 10 is greater than 5. Low is the dominant strategy, just like defect was. And the low in this oligopoly game is the defect strategy. We agreed on a high price. We agreed to conspire on a high price. Charging low, producing a whole bunch, and charging a little bit is a betrayal of that. On one hand, when people see an industry with a small number of firms, they have similar prices, they assume that they're colluding. But that doesn't mean they're colluding. We have two firms. We have a pretty strong incentive for them to be trading each other. And it could just be them actually competing. Right? Just because there's uniform prices doesn't mean they are conspiring. You get uniform prices in lots of different places. And that's also a sign of competition. Right? Which one is it? So that's the basics of these pressures of oligopoly. But now we get to dig in a little bit more. Because each player in this game, each player in an oligopoly game, knows this problem. They know that there is this threat that the person who they are conspiring with will betray them. They know this in this game, in the oligopoly game. They know it in the prisoner's dilemma game. Bonnie and Clyde know that they could betray one another. They know it in the tragedy of the commons too. People can betray one another. That's why, again, I showed you that book governing the commons about how people try to get around the prisoner's dilemma. So people are aware of this problem, right? They know the incentive is to go here, but they want to go here. So how do we establish cooperation? One word: enforcement. Enforcement, not uniform prices. Enforcement is a sign that there is collusion. In other words, there is some sort of punishment, some sort of way that when people do defect, they have some sort of sanction put against them so that they are then incentivized to not defect in the first place. Essentially, you can do this in a couple of different ways. Change the game so there is a literal punishment for people. Like if you defect, I break your legs. Snitches get stitches. That changes the payoff. That increases decreases the payoff from defection, and therefore, you get fewer years in prison, but then you die because someone killed you. So that's one way. I sometimes call that as a cheaty way to fix the prisoner's dilemma, because then you're not really fixing the prisoner's dilemma. You're just making it not a prisoner's dilemma anymore. You're changing the payoffs, so it's not really a prisoner's dilemma. Again, it's a perfectly valid way to establish cooperation, right? It works in the sense that it gets cooperation going. But there are also ways to establish cooperation while not explicitly changing the payoff matrix. The way we do this is with repeated play. The idea is that prisoner's dilemmas are solvable if you are playing with the same people over and over again. Right? Every day you could take too much fish. Bonnie and Clyde commit a lot of crimes together. We are continuously checking to see if you've raised or lowered your prices. These are all examples of, every day, every week, every month, whatever, of repeated play. You play the game over and over and over again. And when you play the game over and over again, you can then punish people not by changing the payoffs in the game, but punish them by explicitly choosing the defect strategy. I'm choosing this defection strategy because you betrayed me. So that is essentially the punishment. That is the enforcement. Now, to make this work, games cannot be played finitely. They must be infinite. Finite? What do you mean finite? Well, I mean, there's a known endpoint. There's a point where everyone knows they're going to stop playing this game. Like, let's imagine we're going to play 2 rounds of this game. That means I know that the second round is the last round, and therefore I can't be punished in any future rounds. So I will defect. Knowing that I'm going to defect in the second round, then there's no reason to cooperate in the first round, because you can't effectively punish me in the second round. You can't try to reestablish cooperation. So the game unravels. And we see this in experiments. In practice, when actual people are playing the prisoner's dilemma game in this very explicit way of playing the game, and they know when the game is going to end, they might try to establish cooperation in the beginning, but then they see how the game is going to end in X number of rounds. There's no way that we can continue to cooperate. So the game just unravels, usually about halfway through. The game just unravels. In order to maintain cooperation, we must have infinite play. We must not know when the game will end. Sometimes this can mean that we just don't know when the last round will be. So any round might be the end point. Or we just play the game forever. We'll never stop playing the game. This is sort of a better way to think about it. It's a little bit more practical to think about. Like Bonnie and Clyde might consider themselves to be in an infinite repeated play game because they don't know when one of them will die or break off, get shot, right? They do a dangerous job robbing banks. Right? Gang members, too, are sort of in an infinite play game, infinite repeated play. And they are constantly interacting with each other every day. And if you betray one another, obviously they could punish you, they can punish your family, so that's an explicit sort of change the palace way. But they can also kind of betray you in many other ways too, by essentially abandoning you and maybe writing you out to the police or something. So as long as we have infinite play, there's always a threat of a trigger strategy. What is a trigger strategy? Well, it comes in 2 different types. Trigger strategies are so named because they mean that a player will choose a strategy triggered by what another player did the previous round. So tit-for-tat is non-cooperation. A non-cooperative play is immediately followed by a non-cooperative play by the other player, and that non-cooperation happens for just exactly 1 round. And if they are non-cooperative again, if they defect again, then the other player defects the following round. And so the way to establish cooperation, to reestablish cooperation, is for the originally defecting player to then go back to cooperation unilaterally. As long as you make that punishment credible, as these repeated plays, you can maintain cooperation. Because the person will say, well, yeah, I could defect, but if I defect, then that means they're going to defect on me the next round, and now we're kind of stuck. But if I am confident that they will go to cooperation as long as I go to cooperation, then we can maintain that cooperative equilibrium. So, for example, let's imagine we're in oligopoly and it's January. And in January, you lowered your prices against our agreement. I had high prices, you had low prices. I thought we were doing a thing. You betrayed me and you didn't do the thing. And now you got a lot of money and I got little. Well, as part of our agreement, as part of our backroom conspiracy, I said, look, tit for tat. If in 1 month we betray one another, then the other person gets to betray them the following month. So you betrayed me in January. I'm going to betray you in February. I'm going to defect in February. If you reestablish cooperation in February, then I will reestablish cooperation in March. You betrayed me once, I betrayed you once, tit for tat. And knowing that credible agreement, that you know you can reestablish cooperation if you just go back, allows us to maintain cooperation. Every round that you defect will be followed by me defecting one round. So this could go on for a while. But if you know, I can just reestablish cooperation. Then we can establish a tit-for-tat strategy. International agreements, international politics has this exact same thing. It's called a proportional response. They blow up something of yours, you blow up something of theirs, so it doesn't escalate and get out of hand, and you can go back to a sort of peaceful coexistence. You betrayed us once, we'll betray you once. But we'll be friends again. Now, again, there are ways to sort of unpack this a bit, like maybe it might be worth it, betraying somebody once and then going back to cooperation. And then there's a bunch of, work we could do in that area. We're not going to get into that. But this idea of tit for tat is the more important underlying idea we're talking about. It's one way to establish cooperation. Second strategy is the grim strategy. So in tit for tat, you betray me once, I betray you back. We can reestablish cooperation. In a grim strategy, you can never reestablish cooperation. You say, look, you screw me over on this, you're done forever. You're dead to me. Low prices the whole way. We will never go back. Knowing that, you are so afraid of betraying them, you're like, you will continue with the conspiracy. Now, you might think this is an obviously superior one, tit for tat, because you can reestablish cooperation. But keep in mind, because the grim strategy is so severe, the punishment is so intense, that the incentive to never even try to betray one another is a lot higher. So it's this sort of like, if you, punch me, I'll punch you back, the end. Well, this is, if you punch me, I will kill you, which is a stronger incentive. Dating is like this. So in a relationship, you have an agreement to not cheat on one another. You are cooperating. And the idea is if one person, and essentially you maintain that relationship, and if one person cheats on the other, then you are going to cheat on them for the rest of their lives, right? You dump them and you date other people forever, right? So that's the grim strategy that you do, right? That's an application, and that way you can, helps you maintain cooperation, right? You obviously don't cheat on people you love because you don't want to hurt their feelings, but another part of this, the economics part of it, the incentive part of it, is that you also don't cheat on people sometimes because you don't want them to cheat on you. Note how important infinite repeated play is for both of these strategies. If we're in the last round, then you can't punish me in subsequent rounds. So I'm going to defect. If I know we're going to defect in the last round, then you might as well defect in the second to last round, because they're going to defect anyway, right? Because these don't work. So if they don't work in the last round, then they won't work in the second to last round, and they won't work in the third to last round, and the game unravels completely. It's only when you don't know the last round of the game is when these can work. It's only when the play is infinitely repeated these can work. So again, uniform prices is not evidence of oligopoly. It is not evidence of conspiracy. Enforcement is. This is why if, say, the Justice Department wanted to prosecute some companies for conspiring with one another, they don't look at the prices. They try to figure out if there's an enforcement mechanism that they're working with, if there's some sort of punishment that the conspirators have come up with to hurt people who betray them in lowering prices. That's how you maintain cooperation. That's how you get around the prisoner's dilemma. So that's sort of the tension that you see oligopolies working with. On one hand, they do live in a competitive world. At the same time, because there's so few competitors, it's a relatively easy thing to establish this. Now, again, in a pure competition model, when there's lots of people competing, it's hard to police everyone. It's hard to really punish people. Like, there's too many players to even keep track of. This typically doesn't occur in our pure competition. It obviously doesn't occur in Monopoly because there's no one to punish except yourself. But in an oligopoly setting, where you can punish people, there's someone to punish and you can keep track of them. This is pressure. This is the prisoner's dilemma in action. It's always a danger. They can kind of mitigate it, but it's always a danger. Thanks.